This is a list of the top 20 most expensive transfers into Premier League clubs last summer. And this is how those players played. So where we've got a blue line, that's a player having a good season. Where we've got a red line, that's a player having a bad season. And the grey lines is just players who had a meh season. Now it's important to remember that my assessment here isn't about how successful the transfer has been overall. It's simply an assessment of how each of these players' seasons went in 22-23. Now you could quibble with my assessment of some of these players, but the fact remains that even if we flipped a few players one way or the other, around half of these players didn't have a good season, despite the fact that clubs paid a lot of money for these players. So what is going on here? Is this something out of the ordinary? Have Premier League recruitment departments just had a blip? Or is there something else going on here? Well, you may be surprised to learn that the hit rate on successful transfers is actually very low. So on the board in front of me, I've got a slide from a presentation that was given 2 years ago by Dr. Ian Graham, who's the former Director of Research at Liverpool Football Club. And what we've got here is a series of variables of things that can go wrong in the event of a football transfer. So for example, a player doesn't fit style. That might be a reason why a player might not work out at a club. Maybe the manager doesn't like the player because the recruitment department brought that player in and then refuses to play them. And then we have things like fitness or personal issues which can have a huge impact on whether or not a transfer goes well. So what we have here is a hypothetical situation. There's a player here that a team are thinking about buying, and they want to have a level of confidence about how successful that this player will be against these 6 criteria here. So as you can see, the assessments come back in and they're all around 90%. So you would think this is great. We've got a player here who has a 90% chance of being successful at my club. But that is not how probability works. Because when it comes to considering multiple probabilities, we do not take the average of those probabilities. Actually, what we do is we multiply each of those probabilities together. Now we have 6 variables here. If we multiply 90% 6 times, then we come out with a figure of around 53%, which means that in this instance, even though a club are 90% sure of success in each of these 6 variables, they can only have an overall confidence that this player will be successful of around 50%. That is a coin toss. So if we go back to our list of expensive players from last summer, this is starting to look a little bit more normal than you might think. So the big question is, why did some of these big signings have sub-optimal seasons? So let's take a look at some of these signings in a little bit more detail, assessing them against the variables that we brought up before. So let's start off with Gianluca Scamacca, who was signed by West Ham from Sassuolo for a fee of around £30.5 million. Now, Scamacca was a really exciting number 9 who was coming through in a market where there wasn't a huge amount of options to pick up. And this move seemed to work for everyone because it allowed West Ham to bring in a really exciting up-and-coming striker, but it also moved Scamacca into the Premier League. So why did things not work out for Scamacca at West Ham last season? Well, we've got some quotes here from Michail Antonio made on a fan podcast where he talks about that very question. So Michail Antonio says, the problem is he, that is Scamacca, can't play the way the gaffer plays, how David Moyes plays. It's more like if you're up front, you're dealing with scraps, you've got to be more of a fighter, and that's not him. Now I've got an example of what Michail Antonio is talking about here from a recent West Ham game against Lyon that was played in the Conference League. Now, in this instance, West Ham are going to pick the ball up, and as we know, West Ham are a really direct team. So what we have is Declan Rice picking the ball up. He's going to play the ball out here, and what we're going to have is Michail Antonio, who is playing as the lone striker. He's going to have to drift into the channel, do a little bit of hold up, get the ball under control, and we'll see the ball comes into his feet. He comes out wide, pulls the defenders with him, actually holds the ball up, and as he's doing that, his teammates are moving forward. Now, in that instance, what he's going to do is play it back to Pablo Fornals, and then what Fornals is going to try and do is access Jarrod Bowen, who's running up on the other side. So what Antonio has done is he's taken a long ball, brought it under control, dragged the defense over into the wide channel, opened up space then on the other side for Bowen to run into, and then lays the ball back to Pablo Fornals, who can then find him in that channel. And this is what it looks like. Here's Fornals with the ball, and you can see just the amount of space that Bowen is in because Antonio has attracted 4 players of the opposition over onto this side of the field. So that is exactly what Antonio is talking about. Often the striker for a David Moyes system has to do a lot of dirty work in the wide areas, fighting for scraps, often having to do that in the wide channels, so moving a long way away from the box, which is where Scamacca likes to operate from, in that box, being a box threat, but also bringing his teammates in as well. So a very different style of play to the one that Scamacca was used to. But the thing to remember here is that West Ham brought in Scamacca in part because they want to change the way that they're playing, and this is a repeated cycle under David Moyes. He gets West Ham up the table playing really direct attacking football, and then the assumption is once he's at the top, he has to change his play style a little bit, adopt a little bit more control in possession. So they bring in players to suit that style of play. It doesn't work, and then they revert to playing that direct attacking football again with players who maybe don't suit it as well. And so given that context, it seems as though Scamacca has fallen foul of the old David Moyes cycle, and that's the reason why his transfer hasn't really worked out so far. Now, another reason that transfers don't work out is injuries, and one of the highest profile signings last summer was Wesley Wesley Fofana, who went to Chelsea from Leicester for a fee of around £70 million. Now, Fofana had a largely forgettable season because for about 4.5 months of the season, he was out with a knee injury. Now, you may say that Chelsea were unlucky here because you can't really ever take into account when a player is going to get injured or not. But actually, if we look through Wesley Fofana's injury history, we can see this is the knee problems he had last season. He had a big leg break problem here with Leicester. But if we look back into his previous history of injuries, you can see that 4 of the 5 injuries that he suffers at Saint Etienne and then at Leicester are actually knee-based problems. And particularly this first one here is about 2 months out, a chunk of games missed, all because of a knee problem as well. But this raises the question that when Chelsea were assessing Wesley Fofana as a potential signing, if they were to do their due diligence and look at his injury history, how much confidence would they have had that this sort of thing wouldn't have happened? Now, of course, every time a player gets injured, there's an element of unluckiness about it. But when you're spending £70 million on a player who has a history of knee injuries, then you are taking a little bit of a gamble. And in this instance, it didn't work out for Chelsea. Now, speaking of Chelsea, if we go back to our list of players, we can see that they've got 3 high-profile signings here, none of which had a good season. So we've talked about Wesley Fofana, we've also got Marc Cucurella and Raheem Sterling. Now, we all know that Chelsea have had a crazy season. They started the season off with new owners. They've gone through 3 managers in the course of the season and had a really disappointing 12th place finish. Now, this sort of chaos is going to have a massive impact on how successful new signings can be. And at Chelsea, one of the biggest factors that would impact how successful a transfer would be was the size of their squad. We know that Chelsea had loads of players brought in, and it caused problems for the managers who had to try and fit elite players into an 11-man team. Now, a really nice example of this is Raheem Sterling, who was signed for £50 million, and you would expect spending £50 million on a player would result in them playing fairly regularly. But as we can see from this graphic here, Raheem Sterling played fewer games for Chelsea than he has done in the last few seasons for Manchester City. He's down at 55% percentage of minutes played, which means that he's being shifted in and out of the team. He's not able to find his rhythm, and that's clearly impacting his overall form. Another factor that comes into play with Chelsea is the number of managers they have. So obviously, if you bring in a new coach, he's going to implement new ideas. Players will often be shifted around into different positions. And this shows up really nicely on Raheem Sterling's minutes played per position for Chelsea this season. As you can see, he's played in almost every forward position here. And actually, this left midfield position is actually closer to a wing-back position, so he's almost sort of played in defence as well. And this sort of flexibility of position, moving players into new roles week in, week out, can have a huge impact on a new signing trying to settle in. So it should be no surprise, really, that Raheem Sterling didn't have a great season. Now, the impact of changing systems because you change managers actually impacted another signing on our list here. So we've got Matheus Nunes, who was at Wolves. He'd moved there from Sporting for a fee of around £38 million. And actually, in the first half of the season, he played fairly well under Bruno Lage. He's a bit of a box-to-box midfielder with really good vertical carrying and worked quite well in Bruno Lage's system. And this shows up really nicely in this graphic, which shows minutes played per position under Bruno Lage. And as you can see, Nunes has been playing almost exclusively in that central position, fits into Bruno Lage's system, and as a result has a good first half of the season. But then Bruno Lage has moved on, and Julen Lopetegui is brought in to be the new Wolves manager. And the issue here is that Lopetegui can't really fit Nunes into his system in the central midfield space. And because of that, and because Nunes has this upside as a really good vertical ball carrier, Lopetegui moves him out into the wide areas. And we can see that if we extend this whole minutes per position plot to include the whole season for Wolves for Nunes. And so as you can see, we're now seeing a lot more coverage in these wide areas, both on the left and the right as well. And so here we have another example of a variable impacting the likely success of a new signing. As we saw at the beginning with Nunes, he fits into the system and it works out. A new manager comes in, he doesn't fit the new system, and it doesn't work so well. Now, we've talked about the individual variables that can impact the likely success of transfers. But what happens when one player experiences a number of those variables all combined in one instance? And that brings us to the cautionary tale of Calvin Phillips, who was signed by Manchester City from Leeds United for a fee of around £45 million. Now, the thing with Calvin Phillips is that nearly every variable that can go wrong in a new transfer has gone wrong with him. So, for example, here is a quote that he's given recently where he said, "When I first came to Manchester City, Guardiola pulled me into his office and asked if I'd settled in well, and if I ever needed anything to just let him know. He said, 'I just want one thing from you, not to get injured.' And then I got injured." So he's already been impacted by injury, and then he gets impacted by the World Cup, because there's this bizarre instance where Pep Guardiola gives an interview about Calvin Phillips, where he talked about Calvin Phillips' absence from a game in terms of fitness problems. So this is the quote: "He is not injured, he arrived overweight. He was then asked why that was, and he said, "I don't know. He didn't arrive in the condition for the training sessions and to play." And then he was asked if he'd expected Phillips to be fit, and what he said was, "Yeah, absolutely, and that's why he cannot play." So we have two issues here. The first one is that there are fitness issues that are being caused by a World Cup, and a World Cup is obviously another variable that can impact the likely success of a transfer. The other thing here is that you've got your manager coming out in public and calling you overweight, and that's going to have an impact in a huge amount of different areas. It's going to affect your relationship with the coach. It's probably going to affect your self-confidence as well, and Phillips has come out recently and given some interviews where he said that this did affect his confidence. But there's another issue here, and that is that his manager doesn't seem to trust him with minutes on the pitch, and we can show that by comparing Phillips's minutes with the minutes of the player that he's backing up, Rodri. So as we can see in the Premier League, Rodri's putting up around 3,000 minutes, Phillips only puts up 300, and it's important to note that 180 of those minutes came in games when City had already won the league, so they're pretty much dud minutes. And then you can see across the rest of the season, the majority of minutes are going to Rodri, even in competitions where you might expect Phillips to be given more time to give Rodri a rest. Now, it's hard to say whether or not Manchester City should have seen this coming, but what we've seen from Calvin Phillips' move to Manchester City is a slow aggregation of variables that have made it increasingly less likely that this transfer was ever going to succeed. Now, when football clubs spend a huge amount of money on a player, it's safe to assume that that team is pretty confident that that player will be successful for them. But if we've learned anything from this video, it's that there's a huge amount of variables that can impact the likely success of a transfer. And even the smartest recruitment departments know that even if they make the best decisions possible, the likely success of those transfers is still a coin toss.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.